the Clifton Worley Show. This week we have Adam Dolhanyk. What's up, man?
Hey, not much. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Excited to have you on the show. Some of our listeners, most of our listeners, probably are familiar with you. I know we've kind of bumped paths several times along the way in some of these guitar groups and some of the worship groups, and so you're pretty often you're contributing to a lot of the conversations that go on there. And um, I wanted to just kind of get to, let our listeners get to know you a little bit better. And I, one thing I've always noticed about you is you're trying a lot of different gear, and and going back and forth with pedals and guitars and stuff. And so we might kind of touch on that here in a minute. But I kind of want to go back to the beginning, where it all started for you, and kind of let you kind of catch us up to speed.
Yeah, the funny thing is, gear didn't exist in my musical world until about 10 years ago. Um, I I'm 36 and I started playing bass when I was 12. So that's like 24 years ago. And I wanted to learn how to play guitar, but there was a chance to play bass guitar in the elementary school band, and there was a girl I liked, and she played flute. So I just was like, well, if I can get in this band, obviously this will be the way to go. Um, and so, like many young musicians, it just had to do with impressing a girl or something. Um, but I played bass, and then I started playing in this band, and the drummer played started to learn guitar, and I didn't want to be the only guy that didn't know how to play guitar. So I started learning, and just kind of kept playing in bands in high school. And I had a few things going for me that maybe somebody else wouldn't have. One was that I grew up in a very music or artist friendly church. Um, I'm aware that there are people that had really bad church experiences growing up, and I've tried over the years to listen and learn and try to be very um, sympathetic to what somebody went through. I just didn't have that. I grew up in a very cool church, and very artist friendly. I mean, um, I was watching this documentary the other day, and MXPX was describing recording their first four-song demo, and I realized as they were talking that they were recording that at my church. So it wasn't just them. I mean, artists, Pedro the Lion, Damon Gerardo, Aaron Sprinkle, who discovered MXPX. A bunch of artists came out of that church all at the same time. Um, I went to youth group with the guy who played keyboards for Fleet Foxes. Um, I was a youth leader for the gal from Head and the Heart. So there are all these bands that came out or had some connection with that church. It was a very musical place. The other thing I had going for me was that my mom had remarried, and my stepdad is a guitar player, so I had access to his stuff. And then the last thing was that it was the mid '90s in Seattle, and it was just lousy with vintage gear, although we didn't call it that. But people hear you're playing in a band, and it doesn't matter how crappy this band was. You're 14-year-old guys trying to make bad music, but we were getting, the drummer's uncle gives him a vintage ES335 and a vintage twin reverb. And this guy heard I was playing bass in the band, so he gives me this really nice um, Ibanez bass and a acoustic solid state bass amp. And there's really high quality stuff. Um, and then when I started playing guitar, I went and bought like a crappy Epiphone. But my dad then gave me a 1973 Vibrochamp to play through. So we were basically like at this place where we didn't have to actually know what we were doing to be given really really nice gear. Like my first guitar pedal was a green Sovtek Big Muff fuzz pedal, and those are like $300 pedals used now, but like I bought it for like $50 new. So it was just this right time. And it was also a time a few years after grunge had happened. where if you were a kid in Seattle, you just kind of believed that if you played in a band, there was a somewhat decent chance that something might happen to you. Um, and in some ways, I mean, I guess I had enough acquaintances or friends that have done stuff in music that it's not unreasonable. And I suppose if I had more talent, I might have been able to do something. But yeah, I just played music all through high school. Came to realize, um, even though like because of the relationships or the acquaintances we had, one band I was in opened for Pedro the Lion, another band I was in opened for Damien Gerardo. Um, uh, I'm I'm on a background vocals track on a record by the Almost, so things like that. But I don't have enough talent, not nearly enough talent to actually uh, make it. And I came to realize that, which was fine because at the same time, as I was getting done with school, I knew that I wanted to work um, in a church context, and so um, I was able to still do music, but the band settings, I, all that kind of went away. I played, I sang in a band really briefly after school, but that kind of went away, and it all just became very acoustic guitar driven. The 1999 to like 2008 was just all about acoustic guitar music, because that was kind of what was going on for me with church music. Um, I do think though, like when people hear somebody talk about church music, they make certain assumptions, and maybe they assume a certain genre or they assume a certain quality level or lack of quality. But there's always been a symbiosis between the church and popular music. And if you go back to like um, Ray Charles or Aretha Franklin, who just passed away, they came out of the church. Um, and when I remember when I first heard Dashboard Confessional in college, and I heard them and I thought this guy has a church background, and it turns out he did. But that guy had a church background. He When I heard Dashboard Confessional for the first time, I was like, this is church music. That's what our youth group music sounded like. Um, and he's not the only one that's been the case for, where there's been huge artists who came up playing music in the church, and they themselves were influenced by church music and then went on to make art. So there's always been that symbiosis. So I just have always been playing music, and for me, it's always existed in the context of the church. Um, and I think like if I had the skill level when I was 16 or 18 that I do when I'm 36, maybe I would have been in like the level of guy that like played a few bar and club shows locally, but I still don't think I would have gotten beyond that. But that's kind of been my trajectory is playing music in the church, trying to bring quality to that music, and finding ways to be creative within a congregational framework.
Yeah. Well, I definitely can relate to a lot of what you said there, especially about the last thing you said about, if I could have had the talent at 16, 17 years old, that I feel like I've, over the years tried to hone my craft. But if I could have had that back at 16, 17, I think would have been cool to have launched, kind of like what every teenage musician's dream is to, go out and make it. But I think, there's a lot of guys, and this is kind of the subculture we're in a lot of these groups, is a lot of us guys are in our mid 30s. We're got families. A lot of us do, and we're trying to hold down some kind of work, and yet we've got this hobby that we're very, very passionate about. And I think for a lot of us, the church is kind of a place where we can play and still carry on like our normal lives. And
Yeah.
yeah, we're not like on tour, gone 5 nights a week, whatever.
Well, there used to be more opportunities outside of church for the average guy to play guitar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that just doesn't exist as much anymore. I mean, even the guys I know who play in the local scene, um, the amount of work that they have to put in, they need to be able to make money to justify the effort that they're putting in. Um, and so they have to be at a certain level. I mean, it's not like, it used to be that, if there was some guy in the town that had a good singing voice, and they'd sit around the local pub or something, and you could kind of get a little group together. But that's kind of gone away, which I think in some ways is the appeal of things like church music, because it gives opportunity for people to be musical in a community setting, um, without having to be attained to a certain thing or have a shtick. A lot of the guys that I know that are playing locally, they have to have a shtick to kind of be noticed and to get any kind of attention from a club owner or a bar owner. So um, there's some really interesting cultural things that go along with the way that we do music these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of go back to a few things you said. Um, you were naming off some of these bands, and several of them I remember. Kind of my journey coming up. I think I'm a few years behind you and all that. But about the time I was playing in my first bands, these were some of the names of the bands I was hearing. Um, and you know, there was a time in the early, late 90s, 2000s where I really felt like, Christian, or what was considered like the genre of contemporary Christian music, was pretty rich in diversity. And there was a lot of, they were writing songs that were formatted, some of it for radio, some of it for that wasn't necessarily targeted at being congregational music. And then I noticed a shift, probably in the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s, is where like the whole worship genre really took off more than it was. I mean, it was always a thing, but that became like everything went, let's be congregational. And then it went like, let's be congregational but rock and roll. And then a few years later, it's, let's be congregational but let's like do EDM pop. And we've seen these cycles come. But what was it like for you, back in those early days? What were some of your influences?
Yeah, in the late 90s, and I've thought about this, I think on one level, I had a disconnect in my brain that I don't currently have. And that disconnect was, um, there was music, and then there was church music. And that disconnect exists in other places. It still exists in uh, especially black gospel music, but also somewhat just gospel music in general. But when you were a musician in Seattle in the 90s and you were part of the church, you did church music, which tended to be very acoustic guitar heavy. And then you went and played in a band, doing rock or indie or hardcore, or whatever your thing was. There wasn't a thought that we were going to get one of these bands to lead worship as that band. That didn't occur to anybody at the time. Or if it did, it just didn't happen. you know. So I think in that sense, like, we were just trying to, like, here's the song. Let's find a way to make it so that it's easy to sing along and has some passion to it. But the disconnect in the church has kind of changed, and now the thinking is you do music, and so if that music is, if EDM is popular, then that's what we're going to do in the church. Whether
Hmm.
that's good or bad, that's just that's just the way it is, has shifted. And I admit that, like, it may not be EDM, but there are times where I hear a song and there's a song called Revelation Song that's really popular in churches, and I heard it and I didn't really connect with it. And then when Robert Plant released his Band of Joy record, they do a cover of a song called Silver Rider. And when I heard Robert Plant's version of Silver Rider, and specifically Buddy Miller's guitar work on that record, Revelation Song clicked for me, and it was immediately like, oh, okay, that's the gateway for me. That's the sound, um, that will work for me at how I play guitar, how I sing, and that song.
Hmm.
So that's a shift that's happened. I don't know when it happened or why it happened. It just did. Um, it,
Yeah, yeah. What you said, like, and I think that was not uncommon. Like, in our generation, coming up playing in churches, you've got church music, you've got secular music, and then like some of the bands that you mentioned, it was kind of like a little bit of a blurred line. I mean, obviously, like they were people who, uh, expressed that, yeah, I'm a Christian, and but I don't make Christian music. I've heard that kind of like Switchfoot and some of those groups like that. When it was kind of like, we're Christians, but we're not Christian bands, and that kind of it was a little bit polarizing for their fans, because like in that culture at that time, like all the Christians wanted to claim them, so to speak, like the Christian music culture, but they didn't want to be like identified by that.
yeah, and that's a tricky subject. There's a reality that some of the music that was being pointed to us in the 90s was not good.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't even that it wasn't good. It wasn't what we wanted. I mean, market dynamics, are at play in this sort of conversation. And there were bands being marketed to youth that weren't, they either weren't what we wanted, or they were, um, like one of the whipping boys of our generation is Petra and Striper.
Mm-hmm.
They were these 80s rock bands that, for whatever reason, still existed in some level into the 90s. And sometimes I kind of go, this maybe the one of the positive sides of the negativity of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is that it breaks up bands at the right time. Some bands should not exist beyond a few years, and some of these bands continued to exist, and it was like we were being given. Bon Jovi in the 80s was really cool. Bon Jovi in the 90s was a little bit sad. They were trying to figure themselves out, and how to exist in a totally different era. And then we had Christian versions of that. Um, so yeah, so when some of these bands came around, I think the thing was, you wanted good music. So Switchfoot's this band like that, where people were like, hey, this band's actually good. Um, so they grabbed onto them. And there were other bands like that. I do think there's a little bit of revisionist history that happens with some of those bands, where they try to say, oh, well, we were never a Christian band. And that's not totally true. I mean, you started playing in youth groups, and you played at churches, and then somebody played your song on the radio, and you rewrote your history a little bit. So I get a little bit, I think I do get a little bit offended, because I've known so many of the bands, and in a couple cases I've known them or been acquainted with them personally, where I read interviews now where they try to like tell a different story than what I saw happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think the idea of having quality has definitely improved things. Maybe not always the way we intended, but it's better now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can remember the days, and I don't know, what it was like, the difference maybe in being in like artist-friendly church in Seattle versus being in the South, where we're emerging out of, like this Bible Belt thing. But like I remember growing up, and sound systems in a church were 4 to 6 channels. It might be pushing 150 watts. uh, if there was a guitar player, he was playing clean. Uh, drums were really tamed down, and then uh, and I saw like a progression through my lifetime in the church where, uh, from traditional music, then it went to like Hosanna praise stuff in like the late 80s, early 90s. And then it went to like, by the late 90s, you're starting to get like harder, more driven stuff. And there was starting to become a place for, electronic keyboards and electric guitars and bass and drums and by the time like Hillsong came out, like it was starting to kind of catch wave throughout, a lot of churches because it sounded like pop music. And then I remember like when Delirious came on the scene, like that was like a game changing band for me because like it was the first time like I heard like true rock and roll like mixed in with worship,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, and I've talked to guys, who like, they're pursuing country music or rock or whatever, but like they grew up like in this context of music, in the church. The church was like the first place where they were allowed to get on stage with a guitar.
Yeah, and that's, I think, been true of a lot of musicians. I think a lot of it is a little bit regional. I'm aware now that Delirious, and for those who don't know, the kind of connection point for Delirious for a lot of guys was the kilt. The JHS kilt is the signature pedal of
Right.
Stu G, the guitarist, and for me, when I heard Delirious, I thought that I thought they were lame. I thought they were behind the times. I thought they were out of date.
Mm-hmm.
But if you came up in a totally different context, and the funny thing is, a few years after they got big, I moved to England for a few years, and I understood where they came from and what a difference that they made. And guys, churches, maybe your church experience, others have talked about this. So it's one of those things, because of where I grew up, I'm trying to understand,
Mm-hmm.
how important Delirious was, and for where I was at, I couldn't understand it at the time. I think I'm starting to understand it now. But it was definitely a thing because one of the things that happens with me now, because I'm not just doing music in the church, I'm the lead guy, I'm the lead pastor, is I have to kind of think of everybody. And if you're 70, 75 years old, even younger, 60, 65, so much has changed in the last 20 years. We only have had the internet for a very brief time. We've only, these things that are so ubiquitous now, YouTube and live streaming and having a phone that has everything on it. This has only existed in the last 5 to 10 years.
Right.
And so many things have changed for those people that it's very, very hard for them to come to church, which is not often the quickest place to change. Sometimes that's kind of like a sanctuary. It's the last place that hasn't changed in their lives. And the same was true in the late 60s, where so much had changed from like 1960 to 1969 that people at that era were very resistant to change for similar reasons. And so there's always been that tension where, we're in a band on a Sunday morning trying to provide music for the church, and there's definitely people that would prefer that we stayed with something from a previous era. Um, and that's not something that you have to deal with if you're in a band playing out on a Friday night or Saturday night, because people go to that bar because that's the bar that plays country music, or if you go to that club, that's the club that does
Yeah.
cover bands. So it's just kind of a whole different context, but trying to navigate that is a challenge that church musicians have, I think, in some unique ways.
Yeah, it is, and it's kind of like, in my church, I know it's like it's it can go anywhere from where there's people who want to hear hymns, maybe not quite so much anymore, but maybe hymns, and then it goes to the ones who want to sing old praise choruses from the 80s.
Yeah,
And
those have
then,
become the new hymns.
yeah, yeah, and I find like a lot of the people, like the 50 to 60-year-olds, are really kind of, that's their thing. And then you got a few who are like still in the 90s to the 2000s, kind of want to hear like something a little bit newer than the old stuff, but they still like to sing some stuff that's a little dated. And then like you got people who want to be on the cutting edge, and when you're, I think that's something that's important for a worship leader. And you mentioned the pastor thing, but if you're being like pastor minded in that role, is like, how do I first of all connect with these people, but then at the same time, how do you push them, maybe people who are resistant to change, how do you bring them into a new era a little bit, and be open to what maybe the next generation behind them will gravitate towards? And you got to find happy mediums.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is where my background playing in bands, one of the biggest challenges that church musicians have, in my experience, is that the majority of them that I've played with over the years have not played in bands.
Mm-hmm.
In my church currently, our keyboard player is self-taught, but never played with anybody outside of church. Saying our drummer played drums in the school, in the high school jazz band, but in the marching band. But that's not the same as playing in a rock band kind of context. And so if there have been times where a band I knew in high school said, "Hey, our bass player quit or something. Can you sit in for a gig?" And so I show up, I practice with them a couple times, and then we do the concert, the house show, whatever it was. I walked in playing bass, playing guitar, whatever it was, and I needed to make their sound. And a lot of times I think people come into playing and they go, "Well, I want to make my sound," as opposed to being a session player. And I always think of Jimmy Page, when he was playing guitar on those movie soundtracks, like Jimmy Page was the guitar player on Goldfinger soundtrack, and you hear the theme from Goldfinger, and it's not like he was doing Stairway to Heaven. He was doing what the music needed. Some of the reason that I have the gear that I do now is because I want to have a wide range of sounds, and I want to triage as a guitar player. Do I need to have a modern sound? Do I need to have an older sound? What's the appropriate tone to have for this moment? And so in a lot of ways, I operate like a session player,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm looking for how I can contribute to the sound more than trying to make my own sound. But there's still a lot of creativity in that. I was doing music at a church about 8-9 years ago that was very restrictive, and I actually found that to be one of the most creative times musically in my life, because I had to find ways to accomplish the goals I was being given within the constrictions that were being placed upon me. And we made it work somehow. And when we found we found ways to work within those restraints. It's almost like the artificial restraints that producers will put on artists to try to get something out of them. And so I think sometimes church players maybe resent something that if they were in a studio session with somebody like Brian Eno or Daniel Lanois or one of these like big producers, maybe that producer would put the same restraint or the same kind of restraint on them to force creativity, and we just don't look at it in a positive way.
Yeah, yeah. I find that, uh, and you said something that made me think about this, but a lot of times in churches, like you got these guys and they've never played in bands before, and they're coming together and they're trying to use their talents, and it's a outlet to play. Uh, you have so many different types of styles being thrown together, and um, I think you can either do one or two things. You can be like, there's okay, we're gonna make it sound like the CD or whatever, and kind of have the context of a sound. Okay, the guitar just needs to be doing this, the bass needs to do this, and kind of almost like a cookie cutter approach. We've seen that in the last few years. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, sometimes you find uh, that the music gets more tailored to, okay, well, this is what we have and this is the arrangement, and we want to do this song, but we can't make it sound like the record. Let's put this into context. How can we get this melody line without maybe maybe you have to put the guitar player on the piano player, or things like that, and you arrange for your band. And so I think sometimes, like, a church that's not maybe on the cutting edge can sometimes, they can with those constraints, they can get the song across in maybe a little bit different way that fits their context.
I think absolutely. One of the things that I have discovered over the years is I am not a songwriter, and I am the world's okayest guitar player, but I think I'm a pretty decent arranger of songs. And um, to find the way that it works, I do think there's kind of this polarizing thing about, do you make it sound like the original recording or not? And some churches essentially are just cover bands. They just make it sound
Mm-hmm.
exactly like the original recording, and some churches totally shun that. What I usually tell musicians that I work with is, you should at least try to be able to do the original recording, because it's one thing to be able to do it and say, yeah, I can do that, but that's not the best choice for us, versus somebody saying, I don't have to do that, or I shouldn't have to do that, but the real reason is that they don't want to try hard enough.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I can't hang with. Like, I want to be able to say, we're doing this differently because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the lazy thing to do, or I don't want to commit my efforts to that. But then, yeah, you find what works, and what works for your musicians. I'll hear a song and think, man, that's a great song. I don't think our band can pull that off. And I've been in enough different churches where I know that the band at this one church would have been able to pull it off, and it was great. And then I gone to a different church a few years later, and yeah, there's no way that we're doing that song. But there's a song that we can do here that wouldn't have worked at the last place. But finding those contexts and those moments. In 2011, I was part of a new church an hour north of Seattle. And two things kind of happened at once. That kind of neo-folk wave of music was coming through.
Mm-hmm.
Mumford and Sons had come out, Head in the Heart, Fleet Foxes, a bunch of bands had that sound. And then at the same time, where we started the church, the number 1, 2, 3, and 5 radio stations in that area were all country. And so I shifted very heavily towards a folksy, neo-Americana sound. And we actually found a lot of the old hymns worked well for that. But then that that moment passed, and a few years later I shifted again. I wasn't doing that. So I think it's a combination of knowing your area
Mm-hmm.
and knowing your player's abilities and knowing the moment that you're in. Um, that moment for a lot of stuff has kind of passed, but there's still stuff that I kept with me from it. We do. There's it's an older song now called "Everlasting God," um, the "Strength Will Rise"
Right.
song, and I will just walk into a rehearsal, tell the band, just go full Tom Petty on this, because everybody loves Tom Petty. The hits, "Free Falling," "Refugee," "Won't Back Down." Like, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're at a concert and you were seeing Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, most people liked that. So there's ways to kind of say, that moment passed, but there's still things from it, the Tom Petty arrangement of that song that we kind of put together that stuck. So those are fun ways to like figure out what to do with what to do with a song and how to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to talk about real quickly. So you're from the Seattle area, but then you spent some time over in England, and then you were telling me that you were down in California for a while in Northern Cal,
Hmm.
and now I think you're around Portland right now, right?
Yeah, I live 5 minutes south of Portland, Oregon.
Okay. So like moving from those different regions, what did you find like musically, and maybe even in the context of the church, what was different in some of these areas?
Yeah, when we were in the last church we were in Washington was the church where we were doing a lot of folksy Americana. And then in 2013, when we moved to Northern California, it it wasn't that had not reached that area.
Mm-hmm.
And so I shifted, and it was a lot more mainstream sounding. Um, England was a place that was largely shadowed by its past, and so and the church I was in there just had no musicians. So that was a whole different thing. I was just playing acoustic guitar by myself for 3 years. Um, but you learn to adapt to each of those contexts. One place has a full band, another place doesn't have enough musicians for that,
Mm-hmm.
and then you kind of figure out what works. And it's a lot of listening. Sometimes there were some just absolute failures. You do a song you think is going to be great, and it just bombs. And who knows why? Just we did a song here in Portland that was one of the like most beloved songs at our church in California, and it just bombed here. Nobody connected with it. Couldn't tell you why. It just didn't.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a lot of listening and a lot of just figuring out what the best call is for that situation in that moment.
Well, so you've gone from how long have you been leading in churches, and then like you went to this new role?
I've been leading in churches for about 20 years. I think I started when I was 16,
Yeah.
and a year ago I moved into this new role. So different it's a different setup.
I was gonna ask, a lot of, and I know this is maybe like polarizing, our listeners from the ones who are involved in worship and maybe who aren't, but I want to delve into this for a minute. Um, a lot of worship leaders see it's kind of like an identity for them, and like I see this in the groups all the time, and I have the question that going from, okay, you're not the quote unquote worship leader anymore. You've taken on this senior pastor role. Um, was that ever a thought in your mind? I'm not a worship leader. I'm not doing music anymore, but yet you've continued to do it. I mean, kind of where was your mind in that?
Yeah, for me, well, first, for anybody who's listening and they're still listening and they're not involved in church music, um, cool, because I'm fascinated by hearing people who play totally different types of music and have totally different experiences. What's going on for them? I think that's interesting, and I can learn something. I remember hanging out with this guy who was like, all AC/DC all the time, but I learned a lot from him. Um, but when it comes to this idea of identity and role, and um, part of the deal was that music has always been linked to what I've done, but it's never been the only thing that I've done.
Hmm.
Um, and so for me, it's very natural to have that be still some element of what I do. Um, there's a church nearby here that is a massive church. It's like 5,000 people show up on a Sunday morning, and the pastor is a high quality bass player, and he still plays every so often. He'll just jam in. So I kind of like, if he can do that, they've more than enough bass players. In my perfect world, they'll let me play electric guitar a couple times a month, and I'll be super happy. It's harder though, because I would like to have a more direct role, and I have to put my hands off of things. But I think it's healthy that we don't get stuck in identifying ourselves, any person identifying ourselves, in things that will never last.
Hmm.
Just this last Sunday, I had an infection in my thumb, and I played electric guitar and preached, and then I did a wedding. It was a busy Sunday, and the whole time, like, this blister on my thumb is growing. Um, and I had to go to the ER that night, and it was, a whole thing.
Mm.
But I thought, man, my hand is, the only reason I could play guitar was because the infection in the blister was on the other side of my thumb from where I hold the pick. And so it didn't hurt to hold the pick and play. But I thought, my hands are not guaranteed. If my whole identity is wrapped up in being a musician and a guitar player, something could happen. I could get arthritis. I could have a car accident. Something could happen where my hands are not able to make that music anymore, which would be tragic, because I've always enjoyed music, and I've always enjoyed being able to create music and share that joy that music brings to me with others. But it's not who I am.
Hmm.
And as a Christian, who I am is based on the fact that God loves me. Who I am is based on the fact that God cared enough about me to become a man himself, live a perfect life, and die on the cross to pay the punishment and penalty for my sin, and then rise from the dead 3 days later to prove that he had done it. Everything else is just cherry blessing. So if I find my identity in a role, or if I find my identity in what I'm able to do, that's going to eventually fade away. At some point, I'm going to be too old to play guitar, or I'm going to be too set in my ways to try something new. And what am I going to do then? So I think for all musicians, we made our identity in being this young musician, and then we became older. We made our identity in being this certain type of musician, and then that style falls out of fashion. Instead of saying, this is an ability I have that I can bring some joy into my life and into other people's lives, however that looks. So I hope that in my changing role, I'm finding a way to transition gracefully, and still pass on some hard learned lessons, to people that are up and coming. But I'm hoping to not be in the driver's seat. I'm hoping to let newer and younger people have the driver's
Yeah,
seat.
yeah, and that's I think that's a really good perspective. And at the same time, I know some pastors who they don't have a hobby outside of ministry. Like being a pastor sometimes becomes their identity, and I think it's awesome that you're continuing to be in the guitar culture and play guitar and have something. Not that that's like you're living like compartmentalized, but like it's something outside of what you do now. that you're very passionate about and something that you pursue as, a hobby or even playing sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really hard balance for guys, especially as we get older. I don't want to be the guy who spends all his time out in the shop and ignores his wife and kids. And I'm fortunate that the way that guitar culture is expressed right now through gear groups and things, it doesn't really take away from moments and family time, and I'm able to do things on the side. If you're listening to the 60 Cycle Hum podcast, I'm referred to as the inboxer on there, and so I flip gear, and that's how I pay for. I don't make you know I don't make any high amount of money as a pastor, so I flip gear to afford the stuff I have. But yeah, it definitely is nice to have something to be able to take your mind off of work and stress and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you talked about the flipping thing. Um, you did something very interesting at the beginning of the year, and I just wanted to check in with you. You went live on a couple groups, I think, talking about your project lockdown. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and kind of where you're at in that journey?
Yeah, or project failure. Yeah, the funny thing is I totally failed at Project Lockdown and succeeded at the same time. The idea with Lockdown was that because I was moving through so much gear, what I realized was starting to happen in my flipping was that I would get a pedal to try it, not to flip it. And I would
Hmm.
break even. I wasn't losing money, but I wasn't making money either. So what I realized was that if I locked my pedal board down to a certain set pedals, then all of my flipping would be focused on profit generating, and then I could acquire nicer gear. So it was a win-win. Um, and I did. I set some rules up. You know, I gave myself permission to switch out overdrives for a very specific overdrive if it became available. And I said NAMM's coming up, so I am if something brand new is announced at NAMM, I reserve the right to buy that because, you know, what if somebody announces the perfect pedal for me, and I've just made some stupid arbitrary rule. Um, and I did actually end up buying a reverb pedal that it was announced at NAMM because it worked better for my needs. Um, and other than that, I stayed pretty good on it until um, I went and I was asked to speak at a conference for church musicians, and then the host church asked me to play in the band that weekend, and so I was on stage, and there were two other electric guitar players who I believe at least one, if not both, have been on your show. But Chris Bellamy, who I know has been on your show,
Yeah.
and then Rick Matthews, who owns Matthews Effects.
Okay.
And so I'm on stage with these guys who know what they're doing, and I'm the world's okayest guitar player. And when I got to the church, I had my Project Lockdown pedal board, and then I was expecting a standard backline amp, Fender Blues Junior, Vox AC15, something like that, right?
Hmm.
And they take me to the back room where the amps are all mic'd in a soundproof room, and they say, "Here, this is the amp that you're going to plug into," and it's a Dr. Z Z-Rec, which it's like a $5,000 amp. I mean, it's beautiful sounding, but plugged into, we're using in-ear monitors, the front of house, the amps off in some other room. Rick Matthews was using a stock Fender Blues Deluxe, and Chris Bellamy was using his Kemper digital amp,
Okay.
and I couldn't tell the difference. This beautiful $5,000 amp that absolutely sounded better in the room through the front of house and the monitors didn't sound any better. And I at home use a Benson Monarch, which is a really nice tube
Yeah.
amplifier, but it was always in another room, mic'd well, sounded good. But I wondered, would it make a difference? So I got the Kemper, and you can't tell. I mean, in the room, I still have the Monarch, and If I turn the Monarch on, it sounds better live in the room.
Mm-hmm.
It does it. I can't say that it sounds better when it's plugged in and mic'd and off stage. So I sold all my pedals, and I pretty much just use I use a Line 6 I use a Line 6 HX effects unit because it has MIDI control of the Kemper,
Mm-hmm.
and so that replaced my pedal board for $400, and yeah, so that's what I'm using, and I've kind of shifted all my focus now to acquiring guitars because um, the Kemper has every amp known to man.
So you went to the Kemper after this?
Yeah,
Okay.
which in some ways it's a lockdown because I mean I'm pretty locked into using the digital gear now. I'm not buying pedals to put in. It's all kind of locked in.
That's interesting. I have a few listeners who are Kemper owners as well, and they've been trying to convince me to, move over. And I'm kind of at this point where, like, I've owned several different amps, and I know what I like out of an amp, and I think I couldn't agree more about I love the way X amp sounds in this room, and like there's
Yeah.
this little bit of fear of letting go of that, um, because I don't know, if I was to play outside of a church context, I wouldn't have that amp anymore,
Hmm.
and so, but I'm thinking, if I want to incorporate uh my guitar at church, like Kemper may be the best route or something like that. And I've also, the same thing with the effects. Like, I'm kind of like, I don't like the effects I have now that I've changed up my whole rig. It's like I want something more consistent that would, work. And so, like, I think not just myself, but a lot of my friends and listeners of the show and just people that I know, musicians, like, it's kind of occurring to us like maybe there's a better way, a different way, but yet like there's this little bit of fear to go down that path because it's like kind of unknown.
I think there's a little bit of the unknown, um, and I do think that it's not going to be the answer for everybody.
Right.
Um, I mean, I'm looking at the Kemper right now on my desk, and it's a computer. I suspect it's going to last 10 years, but my Benson amplifier over there on the other side of my office is probably going to last 50
Mm-hmm.
or more. So I understand the idea of not wanting to go digital. Um, I really get that because there's a limited lifespan. Whereas, when we started playing guitar, like I said in the 90s, around Seattle, it was just lousy with vintage gear, and we just thought, you get a guitar that was built in 1967 and it still worked in 1995, and it still works today. Um, so more temporary, I think was a big thing I had to get over. But all of this just comes down to what you want to do, and if if you're if you're playing if you're in a gigging band that's doing a lot of like neighborhood festivals, and you're playing like top 40 covers or country covers, getting a Kemper might be a really horrible idea because that's just not going to work for the type of stuff that you're playing. Um, Whereas, for church players, volume's often an issue. Um, I love old Fender Bassmen, and those things are so loud that they would never work for most of the church contexts that I've been in. Same with like a cranked Marshall or anything like that. So to be able to have the sound without the volume issues is really important for me, not so important for some other player.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just finding what works for you. This was the correct solution for me and where I'm at right now. It won't be for somebody else.
Yeah, totally. Well, you mentioned you wanted to kind of venture into guitars more. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure. Um, yeah, it's just the focus. The between the Kemper's onboard effects and which I'm controlling over MIDI with the Line 6 HX, and then the HX has all the effects from the Helix. It just doesn't have the amp stuff. I have plenty of effects, so what's left? I have 2 units that do everything, but what can make a big change still is guitars. And this last Sunday I played my new guitar, the Arcturus, which you got one the same week.
Mm-hmm.
But we both got the same guitar. It has the same body shape. It has the same a lot of the same resonance and all that. But you have humbuckers in it, and mine has a Jazzmaster in the neck and a J90 in the bridge, so it's going to sound very different.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be able to have like a year and a half ago, I had one guitar. I had a Fender Telecaster. I still do. Right now I have 4 electric guitars. But to be able to switch depending on the set list, on who's leading the band, kind of tells me what sound. I got a set list a few weeks ago that I saw it, and I just said that's the Telecaster. The Telecaster is the guitar for that set list and that band leader. And the set list and the band leader this last Sunday, the Telecaster would have worked. I think the Arcturus was the right call. So it just depends. To have that flexibility, I don't think digitally is there yet. The digital effects and the digital amp wasn't there 10 years ago. And some of the effects aren't quite there, but it's like I'm willing to take a little bit of a loss in quality for the overall functionality. But we're not there yet with guitars. And so that's the only thing left where acquiring different guitars and different pickups will really matter. Everything else I can change with the digital stuff.
Yeah. Well, has it ever this has been something that's been on my mind lately, is I've got 4 electrics right now myself, and I tend to be like I'll play one for a while and then I'll move on to another one, but my hope is with the Arcturus, like that would kind of become like my main player, to where like I could forget about the others, and like that would be the one like I haul around and play, and I'd kind of mold with that instrument. And I kind of what I want out of an electric is like to be able to it kind of cover my bases on everything. So like if I bring this guitar to go play somewhere, like I know it's going to do everything I needed to do. And maybe like there is a telly, like a telly bridge pickup is gonna nail this one thing, but maybe like the Arcturus with the PAF style humbuckers in it, I can still get a little bit of twang and chiminess out of it. And so I don't know if that's, I know you had mentioned maybe the Arcturus could be your main player, but is that something that you're concerned about at this point?
I think if you only have one guitar,
Mm-hmm.
that's when you start to think about that. And there have been times in my life where I've only been able to have one guitar, and I've thought about that. And for me, the Telecaster, or I think this Arcturus, would be able to do that. But I think the ability to have more guitars lets you just hone in on a specific sound. And that's in some ways, I have a Titan KR1, and that's one of the appeals of that, is you can swap out the pick guards. So like right now I have a Jaguar pickups in there, and then I have a more Telecaster-ish pickup set in the other loaded pick guard.
Mm-hmm.
but that's not on the fly. I have to do a bit of work to switch out those pickups. But to be, for most of our stuff, you could walk in with a Les Paul, a Telecaster, a Jazzmaster, and you'd be able to cover most gigs. You might be hard pressed to go to the hardcore, the metal show with the Jazzmaster. You might be hard pressed with a shredder guitar to be in an older style church band, but you can make it work with most guitars, and a lot of that comes down to how you play, how you approach things. I think when you're acquiring multiple guitars, it comes down to going from being able to cover the bass to saying, hey, this for this song or this set list, this is the optimal guitar, versus saying this guitar will cover all my bases.
Yeah.
So we're not far off. It's just being able to hit that extra 10%.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And on the flip side, I think the case could be made for guitars different guitars help push you as a player in different directions. So like,
Yeah.
I can attest to that because I started out as kind of a Strat player, and then when I moved to the Telly, like that brought something out of me that I didn't know was there, and it kind of pushed me in a direction.
Absolutely.
And now like with the Arcturus, like I'm finding, um, I'm playing some different types of licks and some different things because it feels differently, and I want to. It pushes me to create a certain way, and so, like, I think it's very important as a guitarist to every now and then shake things up. You know, like don't just be a telly player. Don't just be an acoustic player. Like if you really want to be well versed, like you need to pick up a different instrument from time to time and let it push you and take you somewhere that it takes you, pushes you into territory that you may not have been otherwise.
Yeah, and the same is true with effects and amps as well. I mean,
Totally.
the delay pedal is necessary, but do you have to have it on every song? Do you have to, are there effects that you could use instead of using a delay pedal, that would accomplish a similar thing and maybe help you find a different way of accomplishing it? All of those things are good. I was saying earlier about restrictions that force creativity,
Yeah.
and you hear artists talk about it. Josh Holmes from Queens of the Stone Age, Eagles of Death Metal, he was talking about, like, he will set rules for himself. He takes like a note out of a scale and he says, I just can't play that note, or Brian Eno, who produced U2 and all these other bands, for no other reason than it puts something on, a pressure on the artist to create, and gives some kind of guidance. And I think if you had that, if you said, I have a tendency to overuse this pedal, I'm going to have to do something different, I think that helps you. I think if you have a tendency to always grab your Telecaster, but you have a Strat sitting around that you haven't used in a while, that can help you. I think finding those things that are safe spots for you as a guitar player, and every so often jumping away from them is very helpful. And it's just helpful in life because we get too used to our ways in general. We go to the same restaurant, we like the same thing, we order the same thing, and then we miss out on something.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I think even playing in church, like for me personally, I want to shake it up. Like, I mainly play acoustic guitar every week, but like I want to incorporate, this new guitar I have into my playing. And yeah, it might take a little while. It's kind of like I think of it like Dwayne Allman when he picked up the slide. He was
Mm.
going to learn it, and he was annoying his bandmates. But like after a while, he got pretty good at it. And that's kind of my hope is, yeah, this might be unfamiliar, but like I kind of push into some new territory with our band too, and maybe how they respond to my playing, like where they're not relying on me chunking out the rhythm for them on the acoustic guitar.
Yeah, that's a really common thing in church music is that the acoustic guitar is playing and they would be playing the same no matter if the band was there or not.
Exactly.
And the band just happens to be there. So I haven't played my acoustic guitar in 6 months, and at least. And this Sunday I'm playing acoustic guitar for the first time on purpose to shake things up for myself. But I usually play electric guitar even if I'm the main guy, as a rhythm player, because it forces the band to not just rely on me playing acoustic rhythm. And that's good. But now I actually need to go the other way, and I need to use my acoustic guitar a little bit just to shake things up for me. I think I've gotten too used to just always grabbing an electric guitar and walking on stage. So these things kind of shift around.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely, I think, as a player, it's fun to just shake things up. Um, no matter what you're doing, do something different every now and then.
Absolutely. If you get stuck playing one type of music, you're going to regress. Not You will not progress. Even if you become the best at playing that type of music, you're still regressing. And I remember in college a guy that could play like every riff from the first few Metallica records, and he couldn't play the most basic cowboy chords. It was just totally lost on him.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and anytime you can find a way to change things up, do something different, whatever your musical context is, that is always optimal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, I thank you for taking the time to come on the show and just, let our listeners kind of get to know you a little bit better. And, we've definitely, me and others have, crossed paths with you, but it's awesome to finally kind of hear where you're coming from and get to know you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a fun conversation.
Absolutely. And I just want to add here at the end before we close out that if you know Adam and maybe you're listening to this episode and this is your first time, if you've made it this far through the episode, first of all, thank you for listening, and just want to invite you to follow the show. You can follow me at thecliftonworleyshow.com. We've got a YouTube channel, Patreon, really cool Facebook group where we hash out a lot of discussion about these episodes, and so just want to invite you to be part of the discussion. And thank y'all for listening in.